In today's video, we're reviewing a Sportsnet article which outlines 7 potential trades for Patrik Laine. We're going to discuss each one and decide as a community here which one we think might be best should this actually take place. We're also taking a look at some cash-strapped teams desperately trying to find some players to move here, including the Islanders and the Lightning. We'll discuss all that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, the main content for today is the 7 trades for Laine, but I also want to take a quick look here at the Lightning and the Islanders, who are struggling to move players off the books here as they need to free up some cash to get their restricted free agents signed. The other teams around the league are not overly eager to help these teams out, and they're having a hard time moving some of the players that they would prefer to move without enticing them to throw in like a nice sweetener here. The teams are basically saying, like, we're not really going to help you unless you throw in something nice that we like on top of that as a sweetener. Like, for example, with the Lightning, where they've trying hard here to move Tyler Johnson. He still has a number of years left on his contract at $5 million. They put him through waivers, but it doesn't sound like they're really pushing hard, at least at this point, to add much in there on top of that. But teams are going to want at least probably a first-round pick, if not a nice quality prospect in there. And the Lightning do have some intriguing young players they could consider adding in. I mean, we saw what teams like the Leafs had to do last year to move the Marleau contract. They had to throw in a first-round pick to entice Carolina to do it, which worked out well for them. They got themselves a really good player in the 2020 NHL draft. They had to eat some salary, but hey, it worked out okay. So, you know, that's going to be like somewhat of a precedent-setting deal here. So I can't see them getting away without doing at least that. And really, times are even tougher right now, so it might even take a little bit more. So the Lightning are certainly continuing to push for Johnson as their primary one to move. Still hearing some reports on Killorn being another option, but they've just given out way too many no trades, as I mentioned before, and they've really handcuffed themselves. I really think they underestimated what it was going to take to be able to move some of these players out, or they could have maybe done things a little bit differently. Of course, I know they couldn't really have predicted the shutdown and the pandemic and all that, but considering even how long this has been going, I'm surprised in a way they maybe didn't try to do something a little sooner. But either way, they're kind of tough up against things here. And the flat salary cap, the pandemic, like I said, which was nobody could have predicted that, really put them in a bind here, and we'll see what they do. Now, in the case of the Islanders, of course, they have to look after Matthew Barzal, who's going to be getting a pretty significant contract, you have to think, as well as defenseman Ryan Pulock, who's also quite important to them. They moved out Devon Toews. It's a start to find some money. It's also been reported that they're really close to coming to terms with Matt Martin as well on a new contract. Apparently, he did get a fair bit of interest after his pretty decent play in the playoffs. Many thought the Rangers might go after him, but it's not believed that they were one of the teams who had inquired about possibly signing him. There's also reports that Corey Schneider could even join the Islanders as their number 3 goaltender, likely play in the American Hockey League, and just have that extra experience on hand as their first call-up option, which wouldn't really impact their cap situation if he's playing in the minors. Likely gets a 1-year contract. I'd say probably $700K. At the NHL, probably a bigger amount, like 100K, 200-300K, maybe at the AHL level, sorry, if they go down that road. But it sounds like they're probably holding off, just kind of waiting to get the other deals sorted out. Same goes for Andy Green. I think there's somewhat of a handshake agreement for him to come back on a cheap contract too. Obviously, Lou likes those veteran guys, wants to bring them in. And I think they're just kind of in a holding pattern here as they try to get other stuff sorted out. But those teams need to make sure they find a way to become cap compliant. In the case of the Lightning, it's even tighter, really. And there's no getting around it. Deputy Commissioner of the NHL, Bill Daly, also made comments on this lately because he was asked about how that would work. And he basically said if a team was not cap compliant on opening night, that they would not be able to play. So essentially, if they can't play, they're basically forfeiting games. So obviously, that would not be a good way to start the season. They would not obviously want to do that, and they would do everything in their power to avoid that. But if other teams aren't willing to help, it might be tough. So it'll be interesting to see how these teams make out as the season goes on. Now in the case, too, of the Lightning and to a degree with the Islanders as well, these players are not arbitration eligible. Like all 3 of the main RFAs in Tampa, Sorelli, Chernak, and Sergachev, Barzal falls in that category as well. They're not arbitration eligible, so it's not like they're going to have contracts that are going to be completed here in short order. Like anybody who's arbitration eligible, you know it won't be too long before they come to terms, but if they don't have that, then these contract negotiations could drag on for quite some time, like we saw before with like Nylander and Marner, etc. So there's no big rush. They can kind of wait to move players out and before they get them signed. So that's another scenario that could unfold. If Tampa can't find ways to clear money, then they might have to just not sign these players. They might not be able to play, essentially, because they're kind of stuck. Which I think there should be something more to protect these players to get their contracts. Like, they should make it a little bit easier, I think, to be arbitration eligible, but obviously they're not. So they're kind of could get caught in limbo here. So we'll see what happens as the offseason carries on here for these two teams struggling to find some salary. Now, in the case of Patrik Laine, of course, the player we've talked about now, over the past few days, there's been a lot of reports about trade talks heating up around the young forward. He's unhappy about not getting top-line minutes. His agents feel it's mutually beneficial for the Jets and Laine to move on. The Jets can get a pretty good return, fill some other holes in their team, maybe even be a better team without him. It's difficult to say. It depends on how the trade goes, essentially, which is hard to predict. But there's the latest article here from Jets reporter Ken Wiebe at Sportsnet, who outlines 7 teams he feels will be able to put together a pretty good package for the Winnipeg Jets to consider and how we can kind of look at these. So I want to look at each one and just tell you what the article is kind of pointing out, and you can tell me which one of these you think would make the most sense for Patrik Laine to go to from his perspective and from the Jets' perspective. What is the best return here of all these 7 potential packages? Now, first up, we have the Florida Panthers. Now, the Panthers could certainly put together an interesting package. We know the Jets obviously have a couple of holes, ideally at center ice and right shot defense is their primary targets that they'd be looking for in any kind of a big trade here involving Patrik Laine. So obviously, in the case of Florida, we could be looking at defenseman Aaron Ekblad, maybe Mackenzie Weegar, but there's no doubt that Ekblad would be the primary target here. So obviously, that's a pretty good big player for the Panthers. He comes with a lot of term, fair bit of money, and also you'd want to throw in a forward. I mean, from a center perspective, they could possibly look to youngster Henrik Borgstrom, who still has a lot of upside as a prospect. That's a potential. Or they could even look to a guy like Jonathan Huberdeau would probably be a target. Huberdeau's a guy who mostly plays wing, but could play center as well. I would think, though, that he probably slots better on the wing based on how he's played throughout his NHL career so far. But either way, he's a tremendously gifted offensive player. Huberdeau has also proven that he can play in pretty much a variety of situations with a variety of players and thrive in all of them. Mold well with his surroundings and just fit well in a variety of situations. So you really couldn't go wrong getting Jonathan Huberdeau, even though he's not exactly the center iceman they're looking for per se. He's just too gifted to really care too much. If you get Ekblad and Huberdeau for Laine, I almost think you have to take that deal if you're Winnipeg. So that's a pretty solid looking trade package there, like I said. But those would be the main 4 pieces. Florida would probably be having discussions around Ekblad, Weegar, Borgstrom, and Huberdeau. And I would think that the Jets' ask would be Ekblad and Huberdeau. So let me know your thoughts on that as a potential return. Of course, the Panthers could also be asked about any other prospect or draft picks maybe added in there if they really wanted to get a third piece into the mix. But really, I think Huberdeau kind of makes up for that, in my opinion, if they were willing to include him in the package. Now, next up, we have the Buffalo Sabres as a potential target. We've seen general manager Kevin Adams so far be somewhat aggressive, signing one of the top free agents in Taylor Hall. Even though it's only a 1-year deal at $8 million, he was certainly aggressive to go out and get him to show Jack Eichel that he's committed to winning and committing to making this team better. And it's difficult to say what Hall's future holds long-term in Buffalo. But if they were to make a big-time trade to acquire a guy like Patrik Laine, can you imagine Laine on the wing with Jack Eichel? That would be a really fun thought to think about in Buffalo for many years to come. They're both young, both very dynamic, and could just be a 2-man wrecking crew here up and down the ice. I mean, obviously, Eichel's one of the top young centers. Laine's a sharp-shooting right winger. It could be a tremendous fit. Now, what could Buffalo offer up? Well, they could offer a couple of players who could certainly fill the voids that the Jets are looking for. For example, at center ice, we could be looking at Sam Reinhart. Reinhart has played center and wing as well, so he's versatile in that sense. He's still getting better, in my opinion, and he's a player who could be relatively productive. Like I said, he could fit on the number 2 center spot, maybe the number 3 center spot as long as Stastny's there, or they could even flip the 2 around and have him be 2, Stastny be 3. You can put him on the wing. He can play in the power play. He's just a versatile player who's pretty gifted offensively, who I really think would be a nice fit there. They could also target their newly drafted Jack Quinn, who was their top pick, number 8th overall in the 2020 draft. There's a lot of talk going into the draft that the Sabres were willing to move that pick for a solid roster player. Well, I think Laine certainly fits that bill, and Jack Quinn going to Winnipeg via trade here could be a tremendous pickup. He has the potential to be a top-notch NHL scorer. So, Quinn could possibly put up similar numbers to Laine. I mean, it may not be to quite that extent, but many people are quite high on him and his abilities. And you throw in from the blue line either Brandon Montour or Rasmus Ristolainen, and you have yourself quite a trade package, really. I mean, if you take a look at Reinhart or Quinn being the focal point at the forward position going back, and then you look at a guy like Brandon Montour, who I think would probably be the preferred defenseman in that case, that's a pretty solid return as well. I mean, in all honesty, Montour, Reinhart, in a pick or a prospect, especially if you can get Quinn, which I think Sabres would be reluctant to do, mind you, but still, overall, they have some good pieces there that would certainly be quite intriguing to the Winnipeg Jets. Now, next up, we have the Carolina Hurricanes. Of course, as I mentioned before, the Canes are a team that's been linked to this player. I think he would play tremendously well with Sebastian Aho. They would certainly have a few options here. Of course, when you look at the blue line options that the Canes could include, you're probably looking at Brett Pesce as their main target. The Canes might push to go with a Jake Gardiner, who plays the other side. Has been pretty offensive in the past, but really hasn't fit in Carolina. I think if I'm Winnipeg, I'm pushing for Pesce in that case, but you know that the Canes would push for Gardiner. When it comes to forwards, I think Martin Necas would be a tremendous young center they could target. And if Laine is going over to the Canes, you could even possibly look at Teuvo Teravainen as well. And of course, they also have the newly drafted Seth Jarvis. So they have some great looking prospects there and younger players who could certainly fit the mold in Winnipeg. They got a great defenseman and at least one or two of those forward options. I mean, if you could get a guy like Jarvis or Necas in your lineup, that could be a big upside. And then Pesce as well. Maybe they give up Teravainen. I don't know. You're probably looking at least 3 pieces for Laine in most scenarios here. So whatever combination of those players would be involved could be a tremendous pickup here for Winnipeg. So I really like the fit for Laine, and I really like the potential package returned here going to Winnipeg as well. Now, next up, we have the Philadelphia Flyers. As I mentioned before, the Flyers are a team that's really loaded up and is probably in a better position than just about any NHL team if they're looking to make a blockbuster trade, and they could do so with a variety of players, whether it be Patrik Laine, whether they go after Johnny Gaudreau. They've been linked to several different players and kind of going after a big-time scorer to jump into their lineup. And even though they have a really good-looking lineup here on paper, they had a solid NHL regular season. Not as good as showing in the playoffs as they were hoping for, but if they wanted to make a move, they're really, really well positioned. So you could be looking at adding a blue liner like a Travis Sanheim, for example. He'd be a tremendous pickup. We know Shane Gostisbehere has been on the trade block for a long time. I think if I'm Winnipeg, I'm probably pushing for Sanheim to be included in this deal. But Gostisbehere, if it's a little risky just because you don't know if he can get back to playing the way he used to, where he get that long-term contract. Even though I really like the contract, if he can play the way he did when he was first being signed here, leading into that, because he had a couple of really solid seasons here. If he can be a 60-point defenseman again, you have to love that deal, and the thought of it is rather intriguing. Of course, you're probably looking for a young scoring winger back like Travis Konecny. Maybe you want a young player as well like a Morgan Frost in there. So if you get a defenseman like Sanheim or Gostisbehere, throwing Konecny and Frost, to me, that's a pretty solid package. You could also talk about Nolan Patrick. But at this point, as much as I've said before, Patrick could be a tremendous pickup as a center iceman for Winnipeg. You might be a little leery until you get him back on the ice and see, just what his health is like to get some better understanding of where things are at and make sure that long-term you're getting a good investment, I guess, in that sense, because he's been a player who's battled through quite a bit, missed entire last year, and it might be a little bit gun-shy to pull the trigger on that without seeing him play on the ice. Now, next up, you have the Anaheim Ducks, who also in a well-positioned team here to make a good run at a top player. If they want to make a big addition like Patrik Laine, I think he'd be a great fit in Anaheim with some of the younger players they have up and coming in their system right now. As far as adding a top blue liner, they have options like Hampus Lindholm, Josh Manson, who's under contract for a few more years, and you can even look to them to include a guy like Jamie Drysdale, who they just drafted at the 2020 NHL draft. So even though Drysdale wouldn't jump into your lineup immediately, I think he has enough potential upside that he probably would be my first ask, and I would be looking at Josh Manson as the backup plan to play that right side. I really like Lindholm as well. I just think based on what Winnipeg needs, that they would be the better fit for the Winnipeg Jets. And of course, up front, you can maybe look for a guy like Rickard Rakell, who can play all 3 forward positions. Pretty versatile guy. Has been proven to be a decent goal scorer in the past. Might need a fresh start to really rejuvenate himself to get back to what he was putting up a couple of years ago. And then you could also look for a top prospect like Trevor Zegras. I mean, I doubt Anaheim would give him up, or they would want to at least. But if you could get Zegras out of Anaheim for Laine, wow, that would be a tremendously big-time deal, because I think he is going to be an elite center at the NHL. If you could get a combination of Zegras and Drysdale, which, like I said, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't see Bob Murray giving that up. I'm sure he loves the idea of getting Laine, but to give up both of them, maybe one, but still, you know, it's a really intriguing idea if you're Winnipeg going after the Ducks for that kind of a trade, because they have the young assets. Besides those players, they have some great young players that have already just kind of, you know, getting their feet wet in the NHL. Like you've got Sam Steele, and you've got Max Jones, and you've got Maxime Comtois, already kind of got some NHL games under their belts, and you throw in guys like Zegras and Drysdale and others on the way. Like, they have a bright future. So if you can get one or two of those pieces out of Anaheim for Laine, that might be a tremendous pickup here for the Winnipeg Jets. Now, of course, you have the cash-strapped New York Islanders, as I mentioned, one of the teams trying to desperately sign Matthew Barzal and keep themselves cap-compliant, which is not going to be an easy task. We've already seen them make a trade here for Devon Toews, and for them to take on a guy like Laine, they're going to have to move out significant money. But can you imagine the possibility of trading Laine to the Islanders where he can play with Matthew Barzal? That's a really exciting dynamic duo as well to think about, because I really don't see Barzal being the player going back the other way. But at the same time, you'd have to think that if the Islanders have a really difficult time signing him, that perhaps it could be a swap that would be quite beneficial here. You get Barzal going to Winnipeg, who could be their long-time number two center, at least for now. But really, like, you know, to have him and Scheifele, like 1A, 1B, like that's a lethal combination up the middle. So I don't think the Islanders are going to want to part with Barzal. If not where I'm going, he's not even mentioned in this article. It's just the idea that, like, obviously that he's not signed, and until he is signed, if we ever get to that point, it'd be intriguing for both players to kind of swap positions here. But it would help both teams, because I think the Islanders are a little deeper at center, although they don't really want to lose their top young center iceman there. But still, besides Barzal being included, which is not what the plan is here, you'd have to look for a player probably like a Brock Nelson, who could certainly be a solid number 2 center for the Jets, and you have to include a defenseman as well. You have options there, obviously, like Pulock, Pelech, and Dobson would probably be the top 3 you're looking at. You're not going to get more than one of them, obviously. I'd be quite content if I'm Winnipeg to get Noah Dobson, but obviously Ryan Pulock's pretty solid D-man as well. So that'd probably be my preference in that regard. And of course, you do have some other prospects you could add if you want to try to get a third piece. They have guys like Kiefer Bellows, Oliver Wahlstrom, who really haven't quite developed into NHL players here yet. And you know, just the way that Lou Lamoriello does things, he really, for the most part, they really take their time with their prospects. So we'll see what happens, but that could be a great package for Winnipeg as well. Now, of course, lastly, here's the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, the Jackets are a team I think are certainly positioning themselves for a big move based on other things they've done leading into free agency here. And obviously, I think they'd love to have a guy like Laine, because they desperately need more scoring, but they're going to have to give up some good young pieces to make that happen. And I'm just not sure that they would want to do it. As much as they have some pieces that I think would intrigue Winnipeg for a trade, I don't know how willing they would be to do it. For a center iceman, you'd probably want to target young forward Liam Foudy. He's got a tremendous amount of speed coming out of the London Knights program. He's a really solid prospect and really could be mentored by a guy like Mark Scheifele long term. Would be tremendous for Winnipeg to have him in their system. And of course, for a blue liner, though, you're probably looking at Zach Werenski. Like, Werenski and Jones is one of the top tandems in the NHL. I'm not sure they're really going to want to break that up. But if I'm Winnipeg, I'm not taking a trade for Laine without getting a top D-man back. Probably would prefer Jones over Werenski, to be honest, but I don't see that happening. So you're looking at Werenski and Foudy as being the 2 main pieces coming back. Maybe you add an Oliver Bjorkstrand as a third piece as well, who can be a nice depth middle 6 type of forward for Winnipeg too. I mean, all of these teams are in a position where they have the assets necessary to make the trade. Just a matter of, are they going to be aggressive enough to make it happen, and what will Winnipeg settle on? So out of these 7 trade proposals here in this article from Sportsnet, I'd love to know what everybody's thoughts are. Leave me your comments down below. Which one do you think makes the most sense for Laine and the Jets here moving forward? If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.